Hello, History 72A Winter Quarter 2024. In the last lecture, we looked at the greater Atlantic world in the Age of Revolutions. We saw that the Enlightenment began somewhere in the middle-ish of the Scientific Revolution. And we saw that the latter part of the Enlightenment corresponded with the Industrial Revolution, the Market Revolution, and the era of political revolution. This central region of the Enlightenment, and remember that all endpoints are matters of discussion, the purple line here overlapping most of the Enlightenment is called the Age of Reason. This is how the educated classes of Western Europe and its colonies, including in North America, viewed the time in which they lived as an age of reason and enlightenment, emerging from the superstitions and darkness of the Middle Ages. I have been stressing that nothing in history was inevitable, meaning that nothing was foreordained or was absolutely going to happen from the very beginning. Things became more probable as a result of choices, but there were choices. In this class on history of women and gender, I want to make it clear that Enlightenment philosophy of equality and humanity that encompassed a greater variety of humans than those identified as white and male did in fact occur to people in the 18th century. The choices made to turn away from any real idea of equality were deliberate. In this lecture, we will look at the excuses made to exclude women from full humanity. This pair, shown on the slide here, is a quintessential example of one type of Enlightenment couple. Sadly, in many ways, a type largely rejected during the Age of Revolutions. Their stories, both together and apart, are fascinating, and I encourage you to look them up to find out more than I can include here. If you go to New York City, I also encourage you to see this painting at the Metropolitan Museum. Antoine Lavoisier is known as the father of modern chemistry, and Marie-Anne Lavoisier is known as the mother of modern chemistry. Note the gendering of the designations, mother and father, rather than calling them both figures important in revolutionizing chemistry. Before we go on with their story, a few things to note in the painting. Obviously, I'm drawing attention to the research equipment and its symbolism of science and reason in the picture. The Lavoisiers are shown in what was considered plain, simple clothing for their station and time. David, who painted this, is one of the great painters, but Antoine's leg looks a bit awkward curving around the table here. His leg is included in part because it was a particularly fine, shapely leg. I'm pointing this out because even though we know that standards of beauty change over space and time, examples are useful in really taking that change on board. So what do I mean when I say that the Lavoisiers revolutionized chemistry? They are credited with shifting chemistry from being alchemy to being a science in the modern sense, with experiments which included careful explanation of hypothesis formation and which allowed for falsifiability, meaning that others could do their experiments and see if they got the same results or not. Marie-Anne did all of the lab illustration, as well as supplying commentary on other scientists' work. Chemistry was developing. Its mother and father were not alone in doing research at the time. Marie-Anne was fluent in English and Latin, as well as French, and provided Antoine with translations of works from chemists in other countries. This illustration is by Marie-Anne. She has included herself, but her signature was not published anywhere here. In 1794, the Lavoisiers published the first basic chemistry textbook, standardizing to the extent possible for a developing field, equipment, and experimental approach. Only Antoine was credited for the text, but Marie Anne actually was credited with the illustrations, no small thing at the time. You can see her signature here. As their research went on, Marie Anne's contributions got more and more official acknowledgement. This approach to women's education, Marie Anne had studied chemistry with leading scholars in Europe, and women's potential place in science was largely blocked off by the Age of Revolutions. We will look at what happened in the new United States in a bit. Here's the story for France. In 1794, during the Reign of Terror, Antoine Lavoisier was decapitated. Marie Anne's father was also beheaded on the same day, and while she survived, she was left without property, including without a laboratory, not to mention probably being pretty traumatized. Women of the rebelling peasant class, as you see on the slide here, in France, thought that their considerable contributions to the French Revolution meant that they would have full participation in the republic that followed. These women expected to be a normal part of the forming public sphere, to have not just full political participation, but social and economic independence as well. The result was a big no. Chopping off 17,000 heads, a quality revolutionary activity, allowing women to vote and serve in government, far too radical to be tolerated. It was not as if including women in the revolutionary goals just did not occur to men. Women were incredibly vocal about their desires. Olympe de Gouges, whom you see on the slide, was extremely active in demanding rights for women and the end of slavery in French colonies. De Gouges responded to the 1789 French Declaration of the Rights of Man with a 1791 Declaration of the Rights of Woman. She asks, "Man, are you capable of being fair? A woman is asking. At least you will allow her that right. Tell me, what gave you the sovereign right to oppress my sex?" De Gouges was decapitated in 1793. How did the men in the American and French revolutions and then republics square the language of liberty and natural human rights with both slavery and the subjugation of women? Stay tuned. If you recall, the one-sex model that we saw through the early modern period, fundamentally men and women in all essentials were the same. Enlightenment philosophy got out of allowing women the social, economic, or political equality due to all men by making women different creatures completely from men, complementary partners and helpmates to men, just as important in theory, but not equals. You can hear the condescension as Enlightenment men rhetorically patted women on their pretty little heads, even if the men then felt compelled to remove those heads from their attendant bodies. With the Enlightenment, the one-sex model that we saw in the early modern period shifted radically to a two-sex model. The historical theory describing this change originated with the scholar Thomas Lacour, who wrote, sometime in the 18th century, sex as we know it was invented. In this statement, Lacour is using sex to apply to interpretations of the body as distinct from gender to apply to social expectations. In other words, gender roles. In both the one-sex and the two-sex systems, there were two unequal genders, but the explanation given for the inequality was entirely different. There was, of course, more variability than the basic one-sex, two-sex model allows, but the model is useful in understanding how Enlightenment scholars and politicians could reconcile a language of equality combined with quite cogent demands for equality with denial of equality to major sectors of the population. When Lacour says sex as we know it, he means the male female binary in which the two sexes are complementary, perhaps, but fundamentally distinct. The repercussions of the Enlightenment two sex model cannot be underestimated, which is why you will be hearing about it in the next few lectures. This lecture will introduce the big ideas and cover part one, revolutionary change in sex and not so revolutionary stasis in the gender hierarchy. Lecture 19 will cover part two, incommensurable difference in every aspect, the two sexes of the European Enlightenment, and lecture 20 will cover part three, sorting the world, taxonomies, Enlightenment man, white and European as the measure of all things, and white women as Republican mothers. In the European Enlightenment, women ceased to be imperfect versions of men in a hierarchical relationship that reflected cosmic order. Enlightenment philosophers were instead intent upon showing that culture emerged naturally from the body. In the new 18th century view, women and men were utterly and entirely different, not just in their reproductive organs, although we will consider those, but in all features, physical, mental, and moral. We will be looking at confirmation bias in the search for difference, the emergence of passionlessness as a supposedly inborn characteristic of women, the ideal of Republican motherhood and its distance from reality for most actual women, and the emergence of science as a voice of authority in the world, but a voice that was not open to all. That brings us to the title of this lecture. I stand by this title as an accurate representation of the subjects discussed herein. Lecture 18 of Sex and Tea. We will circle back to the body, but briefly for now, changes in the understanding of the body stressed difference rather than similarity when it came to sex gender during the Enlightenment. Organs that had shared a name, for instance, stones, were now given separate names: testicles in men, ovaries in women. Body parts that had simply not had names of their own were given them, like the vagina. And structures that had been assumed to be common to humans generally, for example, the skeleton and the nervous system, were differentiated by sex during the Enlightenment so as to correspond to the cultural ideas of male and female. If this strikes you as a bit circular, philosophers were claiming that women had different social roles because their bodies were different from and other to men's, and then looking for physical traits that would correspond to their social roles, then you were paying attention. These images on the slide are two married couples. The older woman is winding a string, possibly a string of beads. The symbolism applies to the complementary relationship between male and female, rather than women being self-sufficient individuals in their own right. The string represents the bond between husband and wife. In the picture on the right, the woman is also holding a string, but in this case, it serves as the lead for the dog in her husband's lap. Dogs symbolize faithfulness or fidelity. That's where the dog named Fido comes from. The string connects husband and wife. The dog shows their faithfulness to one another. To return to the quote from Lacour, for Europeans in the 18th century Enlightenment, two sexes were invented as a new foundation for gender. In other words, the changes in how people saw and interpreted the human body followed, not preceded, social and political change. The newly named uterus, for example, became an organ whose fibers, nerves, and vasculature provided a naturalistic explanation and justification for the social status of women. Spoiler alert, in case you are all wondering, the special characteristics of the uterus naturally disposed the person in which it was ensconced to domesticity or housework. In a world in which Europeans were expanding their presence globally, European or white motherhood took on a high value for white men, and indeed, motherhood became the sole reason for women's existence. In the Enlightenment, the uterus was no longer an inverted penis, and women were not imperfect men. Women and their uteri were perfectly formed to be baby makers and nurturers. Pursuing any other activities like science or politics or finance might damage the finely tuned creature that was woman and render her unfit for motherhood. Enlightenment philosophers continually tried to define the quote, true nature of woman because women were all apparently precisely the same. Part of this universal woman's nature was summed up in the new notion of female passionlessness. Women were now believed either to have no particular sexual feelings or to possess to an extraordinary degree, and completely unlike men, the ability to control the bestial, irrational, and potentially destructive to women forces of sexual pleasure. Whereas in previous centuries, Europeans had accepted as fact that conception could not occur in the absence of female orgasm, with the Enlightenment, this understanding of conception disappeared. It was replaced with the idea that women, at least good women, tolerated sex so that they could have babies. Both pairs of children in these paintings are siblings. The children on the left are clearly much older than those on the right. The boy wears a manly pink. That's not flip. Pink is a shade of red, so pink was manly. He rests his hand on his hip and the other on a cane, although he certainly does not look like he needs a cane for walking. The girl wears white and holds a garland of flowers, both symbols of the transience of youth and beauty. And I will point out that her skin is scarcely, if at all, darker than the white gown that she's wearing. She is draped on her seat, suggesting that she cannot entirely support herself, weak female that she is. The children on the right are also sister and brother. They wear similar garments to one another and both have their hair cut short. The child on the mother's lap is the boy. Notice the beatific look on the mother's face as she gets a toddler and a young child to stay still for a formal portrait without screaming and destroying the all-white clothing. We all know how easy that is. Before we go on, there are a couple of important points that I would like you to keep in mind. First, old ideas rarely disappear in a flash to be immediately and irrevocably replaced by other ideas. Second, there were exciting scientific discoveries during the Enlightenment, like gravity, and they were made in the context of very deliberate inequality. Women did not go in one night from getting to enjoy sex to having nothing to do with conception beyond lying around being bored but affectionate for 15 minutes every so often. Second, there were exciting scientific discoveries, and I can admire the scientific discoveries of the Enlightenment and also understand that these were made in the context of very deliberate inequality. One observation does not negate the other. On the first point from the previous slide, that old ideas don't disappear completely or immediately, as our story accrues more time and more ideas, what came before tends to stick around in places, even if it is in absolute contradiction to new ideas. It's a bit like a chalkboard with a bad eraser. There is a residue of the old that appears under and around the new to varying degrees. As you may know from your own experience with humans, not just societies, but single individuals are completely capable of holding two mutually exclusive ideas at the same time. To illustrate this with material directly relevant to this course, we can consider legislation on rape and the lack of logical consistency with understandings of conception. In second century Rome, legal doctrine held that if a woman conceived a child from forcible sexual intercourse, then it could not have been rape, as orgasm was required for conception. This was still standard jurisprudence in England in 1756. With the advent of passionlessness in the 18th century, the existence of a woman's orgasm became completely irrelevant to conception. Both medicine and law took up the debate of whether conception could occur in cases of rape. In the 1770s, an experimentalist showed definitively that artificial insemination in animals, no orgasm involved, could result in pregnancy. Logically, if logic and empirical fact were the only matters at issue, then the use of a woman's pregnancy as a defense against the charge of raping her should no longer have been possible. Nevertheless, in 1785, Samuel Farr, you do not need to remember his name, in the first legal medicine text, argued that pregnancy could not take place without female orgasm. Hence, a victim's pregnancy as a defense for the rapist was still upheld in court. Not until the 1820s would there be consistent legal change. Updated English legal texts by the early 19th century, so post or after the Enlightenment, made a point of saying that rape and conception were not incompatible. In other words, no acquiescence on the part of the woman was necessary for conception to occur. Nevertheless, conception as a legal defense for a rapist still crops up in popular belief. Both of these articles were published in the New York Times. The one on the right is from 2012, and it's headlined "In Rape, Candidate Says Political Candidate Body Can Block Pregnancy," which is, of course, entirely untrue. The one on the left is from 2022, and it says GOP House candidate falsely suggests pregnancy from rape is unlikely. Aspects of the one-sex model, as well as the role of female orgasm in conception, have lived on. They just cease to be the acknowledged norm. For example, you will see echoes of the one-sex mutable or changeable body model through the 19th century and right up into the 21st. When critics worried, or worry now, that women who engaged in so-called men's occupations would become unfeminine and objectionably manly to men, a true incommensurable binary would not present such an issue. Women would be naturally so different from men that people could always easily tell the difference between the sexes. These images are small, the cartoons on the slide, but they're showing examples of the uneasiness that men felt at the idea of women looking and behaving like men from the 20th and the 21st centuries. Going on to point 2 from a moment ago, that there were exciting discoveries in the Enlightenment, I am most definitely not here to trash all scientific studies and ideas. I am very glad to have had the smallpox vaccine as a child. Yes, I am that old. And to have the COVID vaccine now. The point remains, however, that the impetus for invoking two incommensurable sexes was not an increasing body of scientific knowledge, even that relating to the human body. None of the new knowledge of the Enlightenment led inevitably to the two-sex model. Rather, the context for the development of the model was political. Remember, the two-sex model was developed during the era of the American and French revolutions. The two-sex model was every bit the cultural product that the one-sex model had been. This cartoon on the slide is from 1808, near the end of the long 18th century and the Enlightenment. These people in the middle, foreground, and background are dead, dying, or scarred by smallpox. I am not making you look at actual photos of smallpox, but the image here really is not an exaggeration. The character in the black hat on the left is saying, "Curse on these vaccinators. Why, brother, I have matter enough here to kill." The man in black on the right represents Edward Jenner, who had begun successfully providing vaccinations against smallpox in 1796. He is saying, "Oh, brothers, brothers, do not delight to plunge whole families in the deepest distress by the untimely loss of their nearest and dearest relatives." If you know how to read clothing, these men on the left are presented as clinging to the past in an absurd way. They still wear powdered wigs, and the fashions of the 18th century, including having their stockings pulled up over their breeches. That last may not seem significant until you look at the modern sensible men on the right. One wears breeches over stockings, allowing the extension of breeches down over the lower leg to form trousers, as seen in Jenner and the man to his right. These men are literally stuck in the past and unable to advance. Early trouser pants symbolism. Returning to the early half of the long 18th century, the 1700s, part of Enlightenment discourse was an appeal to the right of civic involvement for ordinary individuals in the public sphere, meaning in political debate, economic activities, scientific and literary inquiry, and so on. Keep that phrase, ordinary individuals, in the back of your mind. In Enlightenment debates over who should be able to participate in the public sphere, claims relying on time immemorial custom or tradition and theology no longer held sway in the Enlightenment. Instead, discussions of gender roles, rights, and privileges came to be framed, no matter which side someone was on, meaning pro-women or anti-women. Those discussions came to be framed almost exclusively in terms of an entirety of sexual difference. Men and women were no longer essentially similar, but different in every single feature or quality. I am going to keep coming back to this because I do not want you to buy the argument of the Enlightenment power that this gender-sex system represented an improvement for women as a whole, because they were viewed as the complement of men and so valued more highly than in the Dark Ages. I will return to this picture also. It is a painting by the popular artist John Singleton Copley of his family. You'll notice it is an extended family. Copley is on the left here. For now, just notice the directions of the gaze of the adult woman and the adult man. For Enlightenment thinkers arguing that women did not belong in the public sphere, it was no longer because women were less than men, but because they were so entirely different that they did not count as ordinary individuals who were fitted for civic participation. This idea was deliberately used to limit women's political participation during and after both the American and French revolutions. I'm going to look at this insistence on the incapacity of women for rational thought and action in the context of the lead up to the American Revolution before we go back to the justifications of these claims using the body. This is the so-called Boston Tea Party. If that is not meaningful to you, do not worry. I will explain it briefly. There will be sarcasm involved, so you are forewarned. It sounds from people that I have been talking to like the current popular explanation for the American Revolution was opposition to taxes. Let's look at that in the context of sex gender for a moment. In 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty, keep that name in mind, committed an act of vandalism in order to protest the fact that the English Parliament had repealed the Stamp Act. as well as all of the Townsend acts but one. You absolutely do not need to know the names of the acts for this class. Just note that, in fact, Parliament had lowered taxes on the 13 colonies relative to other British colonies. The only tax that had not been repealed was a tax on tea, and even that tax was reduced. The British East India Company was permitted to sell tea from China in the 13 colonies without paying an import duty that would be passed on to customers in the price of the tea, meaning that the overall cost of tea would go down in the 13 colonies. The painting here on the slide is a still life of an 18th century tea set. You can see that the cups do not have handles, so they are essentially bowls. The painting on the tea service may have been done in China, but it was done to cater to Western tastes. The floral decorations are Chinese interpretations of Western floral design in 18th century art. The figures are Chinese representations of Western understandings of Chinese art, culture, and people. This picture is in the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. So if you live or visit in that region, you can go see it. The Boston Tea Party of 1773 was not a demonstration against unfair taxes. It was a fit of pique because Anglophone colonists in the 13 colonies were being treated as British colonizers rather than as full British citizens. You can remind yourself now of the Sons of Liberty name. This is a closer view of the Boston Tea Party picture that you saw earlier. You can see the British colonists who felt insulted dumping an entire cargo of tea into the ocean. You can also see that a number of them dressed up as their interpretation of Native Americans. I leave it to you to consider why members of the Sons of Liberty might have attempted to disguise themselves in this way. Here we have an event that was considered by many British colonists at the time and many Americans in the generations after to be a legitimate form of political discourse and protest. Returning to the Copley family, John Copley went to Europe in 1774 to acquire artistic and cultural sophistication. He had planned to go back to Boston, but the slide toward the American Revolution required a change of plans. This is his father-in-law, so Susanna here, her father, Richard Clark. Clark was one of the merchants in Boston whose investments had been dumped overboard in the Boston Tea Party. The family had 3 daughters and 1 son. The child the mother is doting on is the son, named John after his father. I suggested, as with the Costa paintings earlier, that you notice the direction of gaze in pictures with children. Copley, as the artist, is looking away from the sketches in his hand and gazing directly out of the picture frame. He is looking either out at the viewer or into a mirror, probably, in order to do the self-portrait. It reminds me a bit of when my sister-in-law used to leave space in group photo portraits and then Photoshop herself into that space later. It's actually the other 2 adults whose gaze is of most interest. This is a great illustration of hegemonic Enlightenment constructions of gender. The mother, as the baby maker and nurturer, is surrounded by her children. Her gaze is naturally on the child in her lap, reaching up for her attention. But men had more serious things on their mind, like lost investments and colonial rebellion. Being nurturing and thinking about public sphere issues, money, politics, business, were constructed as mutually exclusive. The mother is all nurturing, gaze directed at the child, face placid to the point of seeming almost half dead. The grandfather holds one of the daughters in his lap, gently, but his gaze is serious, directed toward the intangible and important matters of the public sphere, and is not distracted by the child's attempts to gain his attention. It is not just that women were constructed as obligate nurturers in the Enlightenment, but that doing anything else would diminish their supposedly natural role, making them unnatural women. The woman is compelled to devote herself to her children, freeing up the attention of men for serious matters. I will be revisiting this ideal of women as perpetually satisfied baby makers again in this module. That should not surprise you. Let me be clear here, though. The issue is that this complete narrowing of permissible behavior for women and freedom for men was justified as reflecting the supposedly natural inclinations of each sex. But if something is a completely natural and totalizing compulsion, it would not need to be reinforced constantly in order to keep people in their designated roles. This is another portrait of an artist with his family, Benjamin West, over here looking very classical and almost Roman here, is gazing on his family from above, keeping an eye on them more than engaging with any of them. The woman is surrounded by her children, gaze fixed on the infant in her lap, and the men gaze off somewhere into something important. In the interest of time and getting things out to you in small doses, I am going to break this lecture here and call this part 1, and we will come back to tea as well as alcohol in the next half of this lecture.